Did you know that worry is a sin and will tear a path of destruction in your life if you let it? Most of us probably don't believe that. And even if we do, it can seem near impossible to quit worrying. For some of us, it seems like a normal part of life. There are other sins in life that have clear, practical steps that can be taken to stop. If you struggle with drunkenness, don't keep liquor in your house and never go to the bar or a place that serves alcohol. These clear steps will make a big difference. But with worry, the steps do not always seem as clear and easy. Wouldn't it be nice if there was a switch on your mind or heart that you could simply flip to a stop worrying setting? Worry is a more complex issue than drunkenness or other sins, but still, God's Word does have something to say to our worry. Someone said, "Obedience is our responsibility, results are God's." When we start to take responsibility for a certain set of results off of God's back and place it onto ours, we are worrying. In one sense, when we worry, we are trying to play God or at least momentarily do His job. That will never work out well. Your soul is not strong enough to bear the weight of running the universe or even one small corner of it. To worry is to have a conversation with yourself about something you can't do anything about. We often lie awake when we're supposed to rest, sweating and worrying about what will happen next. We're playing hypothetical situations in our mind of what might happen and how bad it might be. In Philippians chapter 4, verses 6 and 7, Paul commands us not to worry about anything. Instead, we are to pray. That seems too simple-minded, we might think. But in reality, Paul is telling us exactly how to combat worry. If worry is a conversation we have with ourselves about something we can't do anything about, then prayer is a conversation we have with God about something He can do everything about. Whenever we feel like a situation is out of our hands or out of our control, there is always something we can do. We can always move toward God in prayer. If worry is the anxious, unproductive conversation between a problem and ourselves, prayer brings God into that conversation. Paul also notes that we are to present our requests to God with thanksgiving. We see this in Philippians 4, verse 6. What does this mean? At a minimum, it means we should thank God for all the good He has done and is doing and promises to do. That's a lot to thank God for. This thanksgiving and prayer is part of what forces worry to begin to fade. This is precisely what we see from David in the Psalms. The shortest route from worry to worship is to walk from our problems to preaching and then to praise. Over and over, what we see from David's Psalms are problems in his life, some pretty severe. And he finds himself in tough and difficult situations. If we were in his shoes, we would so turn to worry in a heartbeat. But this is not what David does. Instead, he presents his requests to God, exactly like Paul commends us in Philippians chapter 4, verse 6. And he says something like this: "My steps have held fast to your paths. My feet have not slipped. I shall behold your face in righteousness. When I awake, I shall be satisfied with your likeness." Psalm 17:5 and then verse 15. Basically, he is reminding himself of all the past ways God has taken care of him. It is as though he is saying to himself, this situation is not unknown to God and he can deliver me. This type of meditation and prayer leads David to focus more on God's goodness and less on his present problematic circumstances. As David remembers God's past protections, he then moves away from worry and towards worship. This praise often leads him to bold prayers for present deliverance. He says, I call upon you, for you will answer me, O God. Incline your ear to me, hear my words. And then he says, show your steadfast love. We read this in Psalm 17, verses 6 and 7. So many of his psalms seem to start at a low point of trouble, but end with a high level of optimism and hope that God will come through to him. His prayer life turned panic into praise. The reality is that David gives many examples in his Psalms of how to not be anxious about anything. We would do well if we would remind ourselves of Paul's instruction to not be anxious about anything. And as we quote this promise in prayer and pray in light of it, and then we start to preach this verse to ourselves, our focus will begin to shift from ourselves and our circumstances to God and His promises. The promise of Philippians chapter 4 verses 6 and 7 is clear and powerful. If we are faithful to turn worry into faith-filled prayer, God will protect our hearts from fretting. It is as though He will post a guard by the door of our hearts that refuses to let any anxiety enter. It may not make sense to us, but the peace will be real. Our joy in God will be sure, not because we are so sure of our mental stability or so confident that we will conquer the problem, but because God's promise is so great. God knows our requests and He will give us peace.